Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me again. And if you're new here, every Sunday we talk about true crime stories that are either in South Africa or internationally based. But today our story is going to take place back in South Africa. And I'm not sure if you have heard about the Griekwastad murders, but if you haven't, you've obviously come to the right place. And last week we spoke about the murder of Barbara Daly Baitland. So if you haven't heard about that, obviously it is up here. But if you would like to hear what happened in Griekwastad, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
So before getting into the actual crime, I just want to tell you a little bit about the family like I usually do. So there were 4 members of this family who lived in Griekwastad, and they were the Steenkamp family. And they lived on a little farm called No Hook, which was in Griekwastad. And this is all in the Northern Cape, which is in South Africa. And this all took place back in 2012. And like I said, there were 4 members of the family. So the father, his name was Dion Steenkamp. The mother's name was Christel Steenkamp. And Dion was about 44 at the time, and Christel was 43 at the time. So Christel and Dion had 2 children, and their son was named Don, who was about 16 years old at the time, and they had a daughter named Marthella, who was 14 at the time. The No Hook farm that the 4 Steenkamps lived on, Dion actually owned, and he also owned around 4 other farms in the area. So on the farm there was the main house, which was kind of on the top of the farm, and then quite a few meters away was the workers' houses that they also stayed on the farm. And there was also a barn on the farm, but the main house was at the top where the 4 Steenkamps lived. Now, Dion worked on this farm all of his life. And because he owned the other 4 farms, they were quite well off and they were quite wealthy. So Dion Steenkamp was said to be a really big man. His shirt size was a 5XL. It wasn't because he was overweight or he was obese. He was just a really, really tall and big man. He worked on the farms every single day for his whole life. So there's obviously bound to be some muscle built into that. But besides Dion being a very, very large man, he was said to be very caring, very soft. He really loved his children and was very involved in both the community. He was also a deacon at his church, and he was also part of the farmers union. And then Christel, the mother, was a very hardworking woman. She had her own business that she just happened to start up early when this all happened, but she was said to be constantly busy. She always wanted to have her hands full. She never wanted to sit and just be idle at home. And there were also reports that Christel was very sweet and very caring towards both her husband and her children. And whatever her children needed, both Dion and Christel made sure that they got. But they were never said to be spoiled children, so they had everything they needed, and they would sometimes get a treat, but they were never spoiled. So both Marthella and Don were at a boarding school at Grey College because they lived, like I said, in Griekwastad, and the closest school to them was Bloemfontein. So that was about 300 and something, almost 400 kilometers away. So that's very far to drive back every single day just to drop kids at school and then come fetch them again. So obviously the children then stayed at boarding school, and because Dion and Christel were very happy to be involved in their children's lives, they would make sure that every single weekend they would be able to fetch their children from boarding school and bring them home. So Marthella, the 14-year-old, she was said to be very sweet, very kind, very shy at times, but also very outgoing. So she would be more outgoing than her brother. And she was also said to be very bubbly, and she just got on with a lot of people and had a lot of friends. And then Don Steenkamp, he was said to be a lot more quiet, a lot more serious, and he was not as outspoken as his sister, so he was a lot more shy and reserved. But basically, the Steenkamp family was said to be loved by their whole community. And like I said earlier, even though they were very wealthy, they didn't really show off their wealth at all. They lived in a very modest house. So now that we got into the background of the family, let's kind of get into what happened. So on the 6th of April 2012, a white Isuzu bakkie stormed into the parking ground of the police station. So Don Steenkamp, the child of Christel and Dion Steenkamp, came stumbling out of the bakkie, and before the police could even see what happened to Don, he was already on his knees saying, basically, you have to come quickly, my parents, everyone, they're all dead. And at the time, police remembered that Don was full of blood from his legs. His hands were fully drenched in blood, like there was no skin showing, it was just blood. But what they did notice was that Don, like I said, was completely covered in blood on his hands and his legs, except his t-shirt was pristinely clean. And at first the police were like, whoa, tell your story, spit it out. What are you actually trying to say? So when the police actually sat Don down and they asked, tell us what actually happened, he said that night he went to the barn to fetch a light bulb so that he needed to fix in the barn. So while Don was in the barn, he heard gunshots in the house. And he's obviously still a kid, so he was scared. He was hiding behind a workbench in the barn. And when the shots eventually quieted down, then he went back into the main house and he saw his mom, his dad, and his sister all dead. And because this was a very small town, the police who were listening to Don knew exactly who the Steenkamps were, and that was obviously very horrible for them to hear. So the two police officers, they rushed off the scene and they left Don there. And the reason they rushed off to go and see the Steenkamps is because they wanted to see if there were any survivors. But as a side note, these two cops who went to the Steenkamps' house were not detectives, they were only warrant officers, so they were not experienced at all. But luckily, as they kind of left, a detective rolled up to the police station who was very well known and very experienced in the field and exactly what crimes took place in Griekwastad at the time. But when this detective rolled up to the police station, the kind of like guy behind the desk said, listen, there's this boy here, the Steenkamp boy. He said something happened to his parents, like, go listen. And the first thing that the detective like blurted out back to this other officer was, did you get any evidence? What was happening? Did you take any photographs of the boy? So as the detective is still kind of asking this other officer, did you get any of this evidence? The extended family of Don had eventually arrived and they were kind of huddling over him and he was upset. And the detective walked over to Don and said, listen, can I ask you a few questions? And at first, the rest of the Steenkamp family was like, oh no, you don't come and ask him questions. He's going through a lot. Like, leave him alone. But eventually the detective kind of said, listen, we actually need to ask him questions. So he did get Don away for just a few minutes and asked him some questions about what happened that night. So the police officer got a very brief story. Basically, exactly what Don said to the first two officers is what he said to the detective. But what the detective made sure that he did get was he took a photo of a massive scratch mark across Don's neck. He took the clothes that Don was wearing off, but he's heard from everyone that there was blood all over Don at the time that he arrived at the police station. But when he actually tried to take photos of Don, he had managed to wash off all this blood. And the detective actually asked Don, why did you wash that all off? And Don said that because when he walked back in the house, he went to his sister Martella, and he said that she actually ended up dying in his arms, and that's why he just kind of wanted to get rid of everything. He didn't want to remember and still continue to relive that thing in his head. And obviously, the detective knew that Don had just gone through something really horrific, and he didn't want to push anymore. So he said to Don, okay, I've taken what I needed now. Please come back to the police station tomorrow for a full proper statement of everything that we discussed today. So when the two detectives did arrive at the Steenkamp's house, there was a farmer who lived like a couple kilometers away from the Steenkamp family, and he had heard what happened to the Steenkamp. So because he was a friend, he did arrive kind of the same time as the police, and he said to them, listen, I know the Steenkamps, please can I come in the house with you to see if they're alive or not? And because the police didn't really know the layout of the house, they were like, okay, come with us. So the three of them walked into the Steenkamp's house, and they noticed first Dion, the father. Dion had been shot 3 times. He had been shot once in the shoulder, and once in the back behind the ear, and once in the back of the head. But what the police did notice is that he had been very badly beaten around his face and top of his body here. So not only had he been shot, but he had also been beaten. Then they went to Christelle, who was the mother, and she was kind of in a chair, like over a counter or over a table. And she kind of had one arm under her, and she was lying like on a table. I think she was busy reading at the time. And she had been shot once in the back and once in the back of the head. And then the police walked a little bit further into the house, and they noticed that Martella was quite close to her mother, and she had been shot 4 times. So Martella had been shot twice in the chest and twice in the face. And when all 3 of the bodies were sent off for an autopsy, they realized that Christelle had probably suffered the least out of all 3 of them, and Dion had been shot in the shoulder, and it looked like he kind of stumbled to the floor in the lounge area and tried to drag himself to escape maybe, and then had been beaten and shot again. So Martella had kind of suffered the full wrath of whoever wanted to do this to the family. So like I said, she had been shot 4 times, but not only had she been shot, there was kind of another motive to why everyone had been shot, and that was because she had been sexually assaulted. The pathologist said that she had not only been sexually assaulted this night, so sadly this was not the first time that this had happened to her. This account sadly just opened a wound from a previous assault. So sadly in South Africa, there were farm murders that were taking place in 2012, before 2012, and it's still happening right now. So basically, people who live around farm areas or even in the Northern Cape and in South Africa hear about farm murders sadly too often. So when they heard about the Steenkamp family, I assume that people may have just thought that it was a really bad farm robbery and everything had just gone wrong. And because the Steenkamps lived at No Hook Farm, there was quite a lot of space obviously on the farm, and their neighbors are quite far. So when you live so remotely, it sadly is quite easy for these kind of crimes to happen. So remember that I described that Don was very antisocial compared to his sister. While after all these murders have happened and after the police are busy investigating everything, when Don went back to school, he was said to be the most obnoxious kid going around in that school. He was bragging about everything. He was talking so loudly. And the teachers there even said that he was very difficult to control. I assume that the teachers there were prepared for grief-stricken children and how to prepare for someone who had gone through something so terrible. And I don't think that they were expecting the kind of personality that Don was bringing to school. But in the other sense, people go through grief very differently, and this is maybe the way that he was acting out in terms of trying to express what he had gone through. But police, when they were investigating this case, were very hush-hush. There was not a lot of information going around. They actually said that they didn't have any suspects in mind because they were trying to gather as much evidence as they could. Because this was such a small community, there was a lot of pressure from the people who were living there, the press, and obviously the government at the time. In small towns and small areas like this, there's often gossip and rumors that begin to swirl. And there were already some rumors about what was happening or what happened to the Steenkamps that night. And they were saying terrible things like maybe because Dion and Christel were so religious that Martella had kind of veered off the wrong direction and she was part of some satanic cult, and that's why everything went badly. And Dion had killed Martella and Christel and then turned the gun on himself. But those were just some of the rumors that were swirling around. Some people were also saying that because the police were so hush-hush about this case, but remember when police first saw Don, he was covered in blood. When the detective came, he had washed everything off, including, I'm assuming, any gunpowder that could have been on his hands. So sadly, things were not getting any easier for Don while he was back at boarding school. It was said that the boys who were sharing the dorm with him were feeling very uncomfortable, and the parents especially were putting pressure on the school to kind of remove Don out of the dorm because they were saying that he was not cleared of actually any murders. So he was still technically or could be a suspect in this case, and they did not want this potential murderer to be around their children. And the school kind of had it from both ends because on one side they felt that that's true, they shouldn't have a murder suspect in the place where there were children, even though he was a child himself. But on the other hand, Don had not been accused of anything, and in South Africa, and I'm assuming everywhere, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. So sadly, sometimes things in South Africa take a long time to progress, and this could either be in terms of evidence collection and what's happening with that. It could be because there is such a backlog of evidence and at the labs they have to process everything, but also every crime is a priority to someone and everyone. So the fact that the Griekwastad murders happened doesn't mean necessarily anything in terms of speeding up the evidence there, because like I said, evidence is evidence and everything needs to be done equally and fairly. But remember, the crimes took place in April of 2012, and then in August of 2012 the evidence finally came back of that night, which was around 4 months later. So on the 21st of August 2012, Don was called into the principal's office at Grey College, and when he got to the principal's office he was handcuffed and he was placed under arrest for the murder of his parents and his sister. And when the police actually got to Don and they had handcuffed him, they made sure that they walked him through the courtyard and kind of the long way round to get to his dorm, because they did have a search warrant for his room. And they walked him through the courtyard and it was actually lunchtime at school. So all of his peers, all of his friends saw him in handcuffs, being led by police. So when they got to his dorm, they did search everything. I don't know if they took any evidence from there, or if maybe this was just a tactic to kind of make him feel very pressurized to say anything. And remember, he was still a kid at the time, so this must have been terrible. But in South Africa, we have something called the Child Justice Act, which is there to protect children, especially children that are accused of a crime. Because Don was a minor at the time, I'm not sure if he was around 15 or 16 at the time, the police services had to be very careful about how they approach this case. And in South Africa, if a minor is accused of a crime, you may not put their name or actually anything about them in the tabloids or in public records. So they have to be anonymous the whole time. And you have to keep the name off the books until he's 18 years old. Don did have a bail hearing and he was granted bail. So obviously after everything happened, the Steenkamp family assumed that Don would want to stay with them. But he actually didn't. He ended up staying with one of his sports coaches. Don't know why, but he just preferred to stay with him. But on the 11th of March 2013, the trial of Don Steenkamp began. And Don pleaded not guilty to everything, but police did add additional charges to his rap sheet. And that was the 3 counts of premeditated murder, plus one account of rape and 1 account of obstructing the ends of justice. So there was a new technology that was brought into South Africa at the time, which was where you could kind of have a 3D full-on image of everything that the crime scene looked like. So basically it was basically like a video game, but everyone in the courtroom could walk through it and experience the live looking at everything like the police officers did. The first video that they had was kind of the police officers walking in, and then there was Don who was busy pointing out guns at the house. And the guns that they had were weirdly placed because the gun cabinet was actually in the father's bedroom. So the guns that Don was pointing to was just outside the house. Like as you walk on the veranda, there were guns there. And he said that the robbers must have put them there and then they kind of forgot about them when they left the house. But when police looked closely at these guns, they noticed that there was blood and obviously human DNA on it, but there was no dirt. And these were sitting on a veranda on a farm which may have had dirt on it, but they were very, very clean. And also, as a side note, around the house, there was no footprint of anyone else that didn't live in the house. Like, it didn't look like anyone was running away or they were scuffling. It was just normal footsteps. But what the police did notice that as you leave the house, there was blood spatter against the wall near the guns where they were left. So they assumed in their head that there was a struggle that took place outside. But when they walked into the house, they noticed that there was a lot of clutter everywhere, but nothing was actually disturbed. It looked like they had lunch or they had dinner or something because there was still plates on the dining room table, but nothing was broken, or it doesn't look like any struggle took place in the house with a whole lot of robbers. So from the evidence and everything that the investigators gathered, they found that Christelle had been shot first. It looked like she was sitting at a table reading and she had been shot in the back through the chair, and little fragments of the wooden chair were found in her wound. And because Christelle was shot, it looked like Dion and Martella had then gotten up and they were sitting on the couch watching TV. So Dion had then gotten up and was like, what happened? So he walked across to where he thought that his wife was sitting. He was then shot in the shoulder. He fell to the floor, and Martella saw all of this. She was then also shot in the chest, and she had then run out of the house. Then the person had then followed her, and as she ran out of the house, she collapsed on the grass. But the person followed her and then beat her on the floor because she had very bad bruising all over her face. And I assume that the person thought that Martella was dead because he then left Martella on the floor, walked back into the house, and then proceeded to beat Dion. And I'm not sure if the person dragged Martella back into the house, but she did end up coming back in. And it looked like she tried to call someone because there was blood on the phone. And when she did get back in, she didn't really last long enough on the phone to call police because she did end up dying. But then it looked like that the first weapon that was used to shoot everyone once or twice was then left, and another gun was taken out of Dion's gun safe, and then everyone was shot in the head after they had already passed away. But what was interesting was that the prosecutor said that where Martella was beaten on the grass outside and shot again, that was in direct view of the barn where Don said that he was hiding. So maybe Don could have gotten something out of the barn, like a hammer, like something, to help his sister who was right there. I don't know, he could have just hidden because he was really scared. He was still young at the time. But during the whole trial, Don was said to be very disinterested. He was yawning most of the time. But on the 18th of November 2013, Don did end up taking the stand to defend himself. And when he was on there, the prosecutor said, listen, we've got you. We know that you did this. and I can prove it because I have the reason that she did this. So the prosecutor then said that he believed that Don was the one who sexually assaulted Martella, and Martella was the one who was then, done with this. She said that she was going to tell her parents and the police, and he believed that that's the reason that he had killed his whole family, because he didn't trust Martella not to tell them. And Don just sat there. He didn't argue, he didn't say anything, he just sat there and listened to what the prosecutor was saying. Everyone did believe that Don did it. After the prosecution had given their side of the story, the defense tried to defend Don. And their argument of why Martella was sexually assaulted was because she actually hadn't been. They believed that it was actually a tampon that she had put on incorrectly, and that was the reason that she had bruising and everything down there. And also because she had an infection that she was scratching, and that's why she had cuts down there. And the judge actually got really mad at the defense even bringing this up. And he said that that was even going to be dismissed. He wasn't even entertaining that defense. But in a twisted side, Don actually told his defense to say that Dion was the one who sexually assaulted his daughter, and that he was the one who then proceeded to murder his whole family because he didn't want it coming out. And the judge also wasn't hearing that at all. And he said to the defense, if you come up with another terrible defense like that again, you won't be basically allowed back in my court. And the next day, Don actually did end up firing his entire defense team, and he was by himself. After everything and after he had decided to defend himself, Don was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of the obstruction of justice. And the prosecution did prove that the scene of events that happened was that Martella and Don had actually gone horse riding the morning of everything that happened. And while they were horse riding, Don proceeded to sexually assault his sister. Martella was not having it. She was like, I'm done with this. You keep doing this to me. And she said that she was going to tell the police and her parents what had happened. And that evening, Martella and Dion were sitting on the couch watching TV. Don was in his room, and eventually he just had enough. He walked to the gun cabinet that was in his dad's room, and he proceeded to shoot his family, as I described earlier. And this was all in the reason that he was just scared, apparently, that his sister was going to tell the police and her family what he had done. And it was also assumed that Don had become so arrogant and loud when he went back to school, and the reason that he didn't actually want to go back to school was because he was gonna rake in a lot of money. He didn't need to go to school when he had 4 farms on his name plus a lot of money. But in the end, Don was sentenced to 76 years in prison. But because Don was 15, 16 years old at the time that he actually committed the murder, in South Africa, a minor can only be sentenced to a maximum of 20 years in prison. So he could be out before 30, 40 years old. It just depends on good behavior, I guess. Going back to the money, remember the Steenkamps were very wealthy. And what happened was Dion's father, who was Don's grandfather, took the inheritance money that Don would have gotten and put it into a trust fund. But because he donated the money into the trust fund, it can't look like inheritance money. So it's a donation. So when Don actually gets out of prison and he is donated or inherits the money that he has inherited, he will eventually get 23 million rand. Do I think that he deserves it? No. Each to their own. And that is the story of the Griekwastad murders and the Steenkamp family. Let me know what you think of it below, and if you have heard of the story before. It is very sad just because of money, but sadly it seems like a lot of these cases are. I guess that's just a motive that some people have. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for all the support that I've had on this channel, and I hope to see you again next Sunday. Bye!